Welcome, everybody. This is DMG, and with me I have Jeff Dee, a wonderful individual from the role playing game sphere. He's been in it almost from the very beginning. He is from monkeyhousegames.com. He is the co creator of Villains and Vigilantes with Jack Herman, and currently also unigames.us, which is the Teku Mail RPG Baythorm. And there's also a Paleolithic RPG, which is Cave Master. Jeff Dee is a well-known artist, originally in D&D and obviously across all the other things that he's been doing in board games and computer games and things. I've been a big fan for a long time, so this is quite a special moment for me. But I'm sure we're going to be at loggerheads in some things and maybe not in others, but this is really, rather than an interview, this is a discussion about role-playing games and the philosophy of role-playing games, where we're at now, where we'd like to take it, where it was, all these kind of stuff.
Do you have any questions for Quest Givers? Become a Tavern regular by asking a question using video on social media. New modules will be available on the first of every month on questgivers.com, with the complete campaign Kickstarter launching September 1st. You're sure to get hooked on adventure.
Well, I grew up in a little town about a half-hour drive south of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. So I was right near the epicenter in I guess the end of my grade school years, beginning of my high school years, just as Dungeons and Dragons was becoming a thing. And my eldest brother, who was a high school senior, got into D&D, and he was in a gaming club that had been doing a lot of miniatures gaming. And one day he comes back from that and starts telling me about this new thing they started doing. And I thought sounded so great that I immediately drew up a little dungeon map. It was a cross section of a dungeon, right? Like a vertical slice through a dungeon rather than a floor plan, and ran a friend of mine through that. We didn't have any rules. It was just me describing what he was seeing, and kind of got the taste of it. I can still remember then going in the car with my mother to pick him up from one of his gaming sessions, and there was this group of kids sitting around a table. There was a ref screen, there was a grid in the middle of the table, there were miniatures on it, and all the funny dice, and exactly what role playing looks like, ever since. That basic look and structure to what they were doing hasn't changed. And I begged and pleaded with him to bring me to one of his gaming sessions so I could actually try it out. He brings me in, and that weekend they decide, no, they're not playing Dungeons and Dragons. They play Chainmail, which was the medieval miniatures rules from TSR. So, I'm this snot-nosed little, barely in high school kid, and the seniors gave me control of one knight and a group of skirmisher peasants. I promptly got all my skirmishers killed and ran my one knight figure all around the tabletop, role-playing my guts out. Snuck into an orc castle, and they were like going, oh, wait, I think the orcs might see you, and they got out their ruler, and they were measuring the orcs from the parapets down to there was a tree in the courtyard that my miniature was hiding behind. No, they can't see you. So I had a bunch of kind of almost brushes with the hobby before actually acquiring a set of rules and really doing it. We started going up to Lake Geneva for Gen Cons, which in those days were, there was a place called the Arboretum, if I recall correctly, in Lake Geneva. It's just an atrium, right? Like a corridor around an open little park section. Not a very big building, maybe a couple of dozen vendors and company booths and things in there, and acquiring copies of different games. Things like Traveler came out about that time, and got into it like anybody else, but in the really, really, really early days when things were just getting started. What else do you want to tell you?
Well, I mean, it's funny you say, that it's very similar to what it is now, but there's one key difference now is that you can play with anybody in the world at any time, over
Yes,
the
that's
internet.
true. Yes,
Um,
that's true. Though the paradigm that even I've used Roll20 quite a bit,
yeah,
and while you don't see the other players sitting around the table, it's kind of trying to recreate that sense that you're all there looking down at the tabletop together.
yeah.
But yeah, no, there are certainly new developments, but the when people do get together face to face, that's what it looks like. It's this. It hasn't evolved in that sense. Not I'm not That's not a complaint.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's taken it to the next step. I mean, for
I
me,
guess I guess the thing for me is I'm more surprised that it's so much the same now as
yeah,
it was back in the day. Uh,
yeah.
but yeah,
That
go ahead. You were saying.
no one forgets that first experience. And I think that's one of the key things with role playing is that first experience, because it's so different to a board game or a computer game. You your mind in a computer game is it although you're controlling things, you don't really have the same kind of volition or agency that you have when you basically decide I'm going to go into the orc encampment and do certain things. In a computer
Yeah,
game, you have the restriction of not being able to go in there.
I've worked in the computer game industry now too. I was an artist at Origin for the Ultima series, starting with Ultima 6, and I'm a big fan of single player like first person RPGs. I love Skyrim and Fallout and those things, but um, and you get some of that personal
Yeah,
agency. I mean, you can. Well, some guy says, "I want you to go up to the hill and kill these particular monsters," and you say, "Screw that." You go off in a completely different direction. You can do that.
yeah,
To me, the biggest, most shocking difference, and the place where I think tabletop role playing games are so incredibly unique is in Skyrim. You can look down if you've got a nice computer in high resolution. You can look down and like see the ground and little tufts of grass growing and little rock outcroppings and things and gravel at your feet. But you cannot bend down and pick up some of that gravel in your hand and look at it. It's not really there. In a tabletop RPG, there are absolutely no boundaries. Now, in Skyrim, there's the mountain range that rings the area. You cannot get over those mountains. Doesn't matter whether it looks
yeah.
like there's stuff over there. You can't go there. It just doesn't exist. But with an RPG, you can pick up. If you go, your game master might be annoyed at you for doing this, but you can say, "Oh, so we're in this dungeon room. What are the floor tiles like? Can I pry one up? If I can I crack one of those floor tiles in half with like the butt of my sword, and then." Oh, what mineral are those floor tiles made out of? Can I analyze it? I'm going to look peer really closely. Like what kind of geological strata do I see in there? If you had the right magic, you could shrink down onto the surface of that one floor tile and have all kinds of adventures against normal sized ants and things. Shrink down even smaller than that and go hopping from molecule to molecule if you had the in-game ability to do that. There's really no limit to how far and how deep you can go with a tabletop RPG because there's the game master sitting there whose job it is to lay down the rails of your experience in front of you as you go. Like that
I,
scene
I'm
in Wallace and Gromit.
I'm glad you actually said lay the rails down, because that's obviously the modern movement that people are always talking about, sandboxing and don't railroad and all these kind of things.
Well, I don't mean it in that sense.
Yeah, I know.
Right. I don't mean it in the sense of making you go there. I
Yeah.
mean it in the sense of I want to go there, Mr. Game Master, and
Yeah.
he's got to construct that path in front of me.
But you still need some kind of track. That to me, the game master is providing at least a little piece of track in front of you, which is then diverting and switching and is a little bit maybe wider in certain places. That I think is where I come in more. That's where I sit more.
It may be wider in certain places depending on what the game master is prepared for and what his expectations are. But his job is to make it as wide as it needs to be at any given moment. Right. Yeah. That is what's so utterly unique about tabletop RPGs compared to anything that there has ever been. You don't get that in chess. You don't get to say, bend over the chessboard and point at a pawn and say, what's this guy's name? Right. Or go to get to the edge of the board and say, I'm turning right here and I'm going to keep going. You can't play Monopoly, land on Park Place and go, I'm going to walk up to the front door of Park Place and ring the bell and see who's home.
Yeah.
You get to the corner of the board and say, I'm not turning. I'm going to keep going down this street.
I'm taking 400, not 200.
Well, see, you can take 400 instead of 200, because then you're talking about the physical pieces that are actually there, right? Just like in Skyrim, you can go into the barn if the barn has a door that's open, right? But what you can't do is build your own. You probably can now. You can't. You can't. I'm in trouble now because they're starting to add a lot of things.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of something analogous. You
can't go back in time.
Let me just abandon trying to come up with a specific example, because I think everybody will just get what I'm talking about, right? You can only do the things that are there for you to do. Yep. There is no game master who is the guy whose job it is to make up additional stuff to surround you and be things for you to look at and interact with and explore as you're going in response to your questions.
There's a finite amount of reactions to what you can do, whereas a game master is an infinite number of reactions.
Right. Yeah, sure, I agree with that. Yeah. I think I would go broader than that, even, but yes.
I mean, as a part of what a game master's role is you are obviously reacting to what the players are doing, and they react to what you say. So it's a give and take sort of scenario.
Right. Yeah. Sure.
So I think that's probably one of the key things that the early games introduced to role-playing that will never be removed, is the concept of the game master. A lot of people talk about
trying. Yeah. They're trying. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying. There's people who want to develop systems that are like single player that don't have a dungeon master. But I mean, you're essentially just writing a novel in that sense. Right.
Well, I've gotten in some trouble with some people in the industry by having a kind of strong opinion about there being a definition of what a role-playing game is, that certain things that some people call role-playing games don't fit.
Yeah. And
I'm not trying to gatekeep. I'm trying to help everybody have a definition of what it is they're doing. It's not gatekeeping to say that playing marbles or tiddlywinks is not a strategy game. It's just isn't. And if you go into a store that says they specialize in strategy games, and you find marbles and tiddlywinks and that aren't strategy games, that's just unnecessary confusion. I got no problem with people who want to do want to have experiences, play games that are directly about making a story together. I have no problem with that, but I don't think that is quite what traditional tabletop role playing games are. But I wanted to get back, rather than go down that road and get yelled at by some other people again.
In the argument section
There,
below.
I want to get back to what you said about, that you won't be rid of the game master. There's some of that people have explored that I think is awful. I mean, you can get an experience that's kind of similar to a role-playing game in a single-player game where, or a game masterless game, which has the same limitations that, say, Skyrim has, where, no, you're not going to be bending down and picking up grains of sand and analyzing them, because they're not there. It's outside the bounds of the bounds of the written adventure that you're exploring. And there's nobody whose job it is to make that exist and be real in front of you. So that I can role play in Skyrim, but I have to do it with the understanding that what I am doing is I'm looking at the game world around me through the eyes of a character I've conceived of for myself, instead of just me, and then reacting to it like that guy. Better example from my personal experience was WoW. I played WoW a little bit, Worlds of Warcraft, and I made a character who was one of the, I think they're called the Forsaken. They're like the undead guys. And right away I'm given these missions to go kill these like humans that live off in this tower. There's a human outpost. And I'm going, wait a minute. I went back and I read the backstory of the Forsaken, and we used to be humans, and we're not humans now because of something that happened, but it has nothing to do with the humans. They didn't like do this to us. In no sense are they especially our enemies, but the game has not set me up to be a character who feels that way, and yet is commanding me to go and kill these guys and treating me as if it was an unspoken truth that we hate them. And I said, no, I'm just not gonna. And to the extent that you can get away with stuff like that in computer games and MMOs, I enjoy them as role-playing experiences. In City of Heroes, of which I was a huge fan, I made a character, Aquarina, who's a character from Villains Vigilantes. But in that game, your superhero, the structure is you go talk to contacts and they give you missions, and you do those missions and they send you on to other contacts, and that's the sequence of events that carries you through the game. And there's some flexibility there. You don't always have to follow the same path through the contacts and stuff. But I made a character who's like more of a monster than a superhero, and I just had her go and live in the lake on the first map and beat up thugs that were on the shore of her lake, and never went and talked to a contact. Would respond to invitations from other players if they needed somebody for their team. She'd go and join up with them and go on missions that way. But I was able to have a role-playing experience following my character's own path in that environment. But I still could not have bent down and plucked a couple of blades of grass, because they're not really there. I'm still stuck with the hard limits of what has been constructed for me by the team that built the MMO.
For me, I love things like Diablo and stuff like that because of the visuals of it.
Sure.
And obviously on YouTube, I'm most famous for doing terrain and using miniatures. And so, my 7D system is built around miniature skirmishes, but I want to bring in the story elements because I also studied literature and all that kind of film and so on and so forth. So I love the story aspect of it. And sometimes I find games there's it's too much mechanics and not enough of the artistry and storytelling. And you kind of need, for me in role playing, you kind of need a good blend of the two.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree, and that's a tension that I think, I see people fighting against that tension, wanting to solve it, once and for all, one way or the other. But I don't think it should be solved one way or the other. I think it should always be a tension between those two things. I don't think it's a real complete role-playing experience. Like, apart from the little bits of role-playing I can get in an MMO, right, by role-playing in my own head while I'm in their canned scenario. Apart from that, you don't get a real full immersive world without a game master or some mechanic there to serve the purpose of creating the world around you as you go in response to your questions and your needs and wherever the story winds up going. I'm interested to hear that you like to use terrain and stuff on the tabletop. I'm also in favor of the spectacle of having stuff on the table. I know there are role players who think that they are purists in the sense that they want it all to be happening in their imaginations, and I don't have a problem with that. I don't think that is an obstacle to the hobby, right? To what we're trying to do in an RPG. But they think it's an obstacle to have terrain because they think that those things are limiting your imagination. Where I think that minis and terrain and maps, full-size maps on the tabletop, are communications tools to help the game master show to the players what's going on.
They're shortcuts, essentially.
So I don't think those two views have to fight with each other. But we do have. I was still. I kind of went off on a tangent when I wanted to respond to your comment about getting rid of the game master. Yeah. There are ways that are kind of legitimate, in my view, that you can do that. There is a thing called called Mythic. It's a RPG called Mythic. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, I've heard. I don't know much about it, but I have heard of it. Yeah.
Basically, I think it's very clever and mostly workable. The idea is 90% of what you do as a player in an RPG is you're asking your game master questions. Yep. How many orcs are there in that room, and do we see trees on the horizon and stuff like that, right? So what the Mythic Game Master emulator book does is provides a system for kind of generically generating answers to your questions while factoring in the established continuity. So the players together can ask the question, are there trees on the horizon over there, and talk among themselves. Well, where are we in the world? What does our world map that we do have show? Should we be getting near the forest? Does it seem reasonable? Oh no, this is by that desert land, and you figure out pros and cons and come up with an odds, right? And then you roll dice, and the dice test those odds and answer your question, yes or no, or there's I think a provision for a strong yes and a strong no that you can interpret to mean things. Using that, a group of players can kind of get the work done of making the world appear around them in response to their questions the way it does when there's a human game master there. It works pretty well and is not it's not just a canned experience with hard boundaries to it.
My immediate reaction, and I haven't played it, is wouldn't you get bogged down in the mud of the minutia of trying to figure out what's happening, whereas a dungeon master or game master would be able to immediately respond?
There's that risk, but most of the time, if you're playing a traditional RPG, you're not bogged down in that much minutia. Yeah. But sure, you can get there. It's meant for a group, and I think works best when there's multiple players there. so they can kind of step in and say, you know what, we don't care how many rings that tree's got, right? the kind of minutia I was talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
And stop, just like your game master could say, no, Jeff, I'm not going. Yes, you picked up your grains of sand. Now stop bothering me. I'm not. No, I'm not going to tell you what. Oh, there's some orcs banging on the door now. So no, you're
The
not going to be
orcs,
able to
Jeff, the
find out.
orcs.
We're not going to be able to find out what minerals your grains of sand are made out of right now. Okay. But I think it's for what Mythic's not real good at is if you want to play out an encounter with terrain, it's not going to be able to tell you where to put all the walls and the trees and the roads and the patches of mud and stuff, right? It's not going to know that. A very efficient way of answering those things. Just a creative DM at the table saying, "Oh, here you go," and I put some terrain drink over, but put some terrain pieces down, and there's things in here. Put the monsters over here, and that works a lot better for that. But it's pretty effective. You might want to give it a shot.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of mechanics and different ways of doing things. I mean, it's one of the reasons for developing my system is basically because there's so many things that I like in certain games, but I don't like the rest of the game. But I want to keep that feeling or sense of what's happening,
Right.
and try to put it in. Obviously, there's some things you got to leave out and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's always that give and take. Some games you really do not need a rule for, sweeping a guy's legs out from under him in a fight. But other ones you definitely do, right? If it's martial artsy game, you totally have to have that. If it's a game about your high school kids on bicycles running around, finding out what's in Farmer Jones's field, you probably don't need to have that particular mechanic.
Well, you
But the
had
mechanics are all. Sorry, yeah.
you had an interesting post on Facebook about mechanics, and yeah, you were kind of what we're talking about now is where you were going, and it was sort of we kind of think down the same road. I think because it's just reading one post, but where mechanics kind of get in the way in some instances, and also that the mechanics are there not to be ignored. I think part of what you were saying was that like the rules are there to be rules, not to be something that should be ignored. Could you expand on that if I'm
Yeah,
correct or
yeah.
incorrect?
I see. That's me trying to tread this straight down the line. Yes, it's all good kind
Mm.
of path, rather than being, the GM is everything over here, or rules are everything over here. I think you need to have both. So my objective is to try to find the best path that includes both. Yeah, the game that there are people who on the along the lines of Mythic where that is a mechanism, a diced mechanism for providing a lot of what a game master provides. There are other techniques for getting rid of a GM that I'm not so keen on, if you're going to call the thing a role-playing game, and those are when you get into story games where it's really about telling a story together and not about being immersed in a virtual environment together. That's fine if people want to play those kind of games. I have no objection to that. I'm not trying to denigrate anybody, but I think that is a fundamentally different kind of experience. So if assuming you're going to have a game master, you can either have no rules, which has been done. There's diceless role-playing games have been published, or you can have some rules, or you can have a lot of rules. And what's the best way? Well, what are rules for? Rules are for resolving questions so the game master isn't the one that comes to the conclusion. Well, why would you want that? And there's a number of reasons. One is the poor game master is there to entertain you. That's what I see as fundamentally the game master's job. He is a kind of entertainer. And it's work. Making stuff up is work, and answering question after question after question after question is work. So, for one thing, you might want rules so you do not have to make up absolutely everything completely out of your head at an even moment. Another thing is there's fairness issues that arise when you have a person who is making up answers. So just as a probability crutch, so the game master can say, look, you guys chose to do this. There are mechanics for saying what happened. I'm sorry, I rolled the dice this way, and that guy is dead. If you just make that up, then it's all on you as the GM, right? And I think that's just hard for people to run that way and not eventually alienate their players.
Well, in the same way that society has laws, it's just, you don't go around murdering people because, obviously there's the moral thing in your brain that you don't want to, but there's also, the legal aspect of it that you want to live in a society.
But I'm not, I don't think, I don't think I'm with you though on the idea that there is a moral or legal necessity for rules in RPGs. I really think they're there to serve practical functions.
Yeah.
So that the game can proceed and the game master isn't like, a nervous wreck at the end of every episode, and so to avoid bad feelings and stuff like that. Another issue is giving players their due. When a character has abilities, I think there should be rules for resolving whether those abilities work and how well and what happens, because otherwise a game master just making things up is not always going to give them fair due for what their character's abilities are. And another good reason for rules is because of continuity. If we've established that a sword is this kind of weapon that is this effective in these situations, then swords should remain that effective in those situations and not, kind of wander around and be more effective in some situations and less in others just because the game master doesn't remember. So all of those reasons are, in my view, justifications for having a set of rules. But the set of rules then is a tool for the GM, not what I think that there are people who are too far in favor of rules, who start viewing the game master as merely a functionary whose job it is to apply the mechanics, because you're never going to get that. I like to tell my little story about picking up little tiny objects and examining them. You're never going to get that if you don't accept that your game master is this creative force in your game who can cause things to exist when they need to. If the game master is just a judge, just a referee. So yeah, I'm staunchly in the middle.
There's people who say that we've got all the games that we need. We don't need any more new games.
The first time I heard that is about 1982.
And it's
So,
there's
that makes me laugh.
popular friends of mine on YouTube who've said, we've got everything we need. We don't really need to don't waste your time developing a new game. And it's like, sorry, can't agree. I have to go. The reason I was saying, I think there's that tension between GM and rules that is always going to be there, and I think we should start accepting it as a good thing, and not as a problem to be solved. And I feel the same way about the need for new sets of rules. I think people are always going to be coming up with new ideas of how to resolve things that
are better in some ways and worse in other ways, and there's always going to be a tension there too. And I think we should accept that human creativity in that regard is not a problem to be solved, but a wonderful thing to be welcomed and explored.
I also am the opinion that we're actually in the very early stages of what role-playing actually is. If you look at history of things like cinema and theater as, devices of entertainment, cinema over a 50-year period, you look at where it went from the early 1900s to the 1950s, there were a lot of changes, but when you look at what we're doing now, it's chalk and cheese,
Technologically, I think you're absolutely right.
But at the core, as you say, with the social aspect and the artistry and all those sort of things, that is going to maintain itself all the way through.
And the structure of what a role playing game is compared to all other kinds of games, right? So I'm not in the camp who says it's all about story. I think it's about story in the sense that when you do a simulation of some things, then at the end you've got a story of what happened. Not at the beginning, our goal is to make a story happen, and here are some rules to guarantee that we have a proper 3-act structure, or this or that, or that everything that happens is dramatically appropriate. I don't think that is what role-playing games must be about. If there's a way to do that without breaking everything else I love about RPGs, I'd be happy to see it. But the structure is it's sort of role-playing games are sort of, you've got a rules framework and a person, and the person is your game master. They use the rules framework to as a tool to help them resolve things, but then that enables you to be in an environment where the rules resolve issues as they come up, and the game master kind of makes that world come alive and makes it be a real place. They give voice to the characters that you run into. They think about the social and political ramifications of what your characters do. What those 3 orcs that got away. It's always orcs with me. I'm sorry. I don't even mostly play. Oh yeah, I'll go goblins for a while, but I don't even mostly play fantasy anymore. I mostly play superheroes. But it's 3 goblins that got away. What are they going to do, right? There's no rules for this. Where are they from? How far away is their tribe? Is there any more tribe? Are there enemy goblin tribes? Maybe they go and get murdered by the enemy goblins that live in the next county. We don't know, but that's the game master's job to think about stuff like that. Brings that world alive in a way that Skyrim and things like that just aren't. They aren't alive in that sense.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. Go ahead. I went off on a little tangent again. I get excited.
The humanity of it, obviously it's created by human beings. I'm talking about like Skyrim and things like that. It's created by human beings. It's wonderful to play, wonderful to look at, but there is a wall that you will hit. Whereas with a role-playing... For now, I mean, until the next upgrade.
We're gonna get artificial intelligence, right? We got intelligence. Just got to figure out how it's built, and then we can build our own, and then we're gonna have GM in a box. It's gonna happen, but it hasn't happened yet. But when it does happen, that AI that's being a game master is going to have to do the same job that human game masters do now. It's not going to be able to, rest on its laurels and say, well, a canned setting like Skyrim was good enough for him before, so I'll just keep giving him those. People will play and say, you're a crappy game master. You're never going to let us go over those mountains? Seriously? We want to. We're bending all of our effort and all of our magic spells and all of our powers, right? And all of our political influence. We're building a freaking bridge over the mountains.
I think the biggest peril is not the AI game master. It's the bot players that will then get into the game and they'll just play with each other, and we'll be sitting there. Hang on a minute, what just happened? So, how do you think, speaking about technology and all that, how do you think
Yeah.
the role-playing games will evolve from this point? I mean, obviously, it's very difficult to look into the future more than 2 minutes, but sort of the trend of where things are going. How do you feel that, it will move from here?
So we were talking earlier about supplanting the game master or limiting the game master's role, and I've recently picked up a book by Rob Kuntz that is about Dave Arneson and his early design work that eventually led to Dungeons and Dragons. And I read a review of the book where the author ended by complaining that Dungeons and Dragons has evolved into a thing where you're unlike the old days where the game master would sit down with graph paper and hex paper and map out their world and fill notebooks full of characters that they've made up and stuff, that it's evolved more into you buy canned adventures and you play a series of them, and there's many more specific rules for more things, leaving the game master as more of just a functionary now whose job it is to apply the rules and walk you through the store-bought adventures. And I think that reviewer had a point, that is definitely a thing that is happening with role-playing games that wasn't quite like that in the early days, though with a caveat that just because you've got a canned adventure does not mean that the game master is not making things up, and just because you have written rules does not mean the game master cannot override those and say, you know what, we're not going to apply this overly cumbersome sweeping the legs out from under a guy mechanic. Sure, you knocked that goblin down with your leg sweep. So I think that there is a trend toward the trend toward making role-playing games more accessible is a trend toward making it easier to game master by taking more work off the game master's shoulder, which does look like it does look like limiting the GM to being more of a functionary and being less a creative force and more of a just a guy that reads the pre-written adventures. But I don't know how far that will go, and if it goes all the way, then you don't have role-playing games anymore. You have, the Dungeon board game, or there's been a number of a Descent, I believe, was like a dungeon crawling board game, which doesn't have a GM. It's all canned adventures, and you can play it that way. Those aren't, I think it's possible to design yourself back out of the role-playing game hobby paradigm and into a strategy game paradigm where role-playing isn't necessary. You're just moving your pieces and rolling your dice and not living in an actual world and being an actual character. So that's a danger that I see with role-playing games.
Well,
on the other hand,
sorry.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of Warhammer Quest, which again is a DM-less system. But to me, it's always a board game. It's not a role-playing game. Yeah. But there is a role-playing rule book where you can use all the bits and pieces from the game as terrain in an actual role-playing game. And to me, that was great.
I think I bought 2 sets of Warhammer Quest because I love their dungeon tile pieces so much.
Yeah.
And I created a whole bunch of additional dungeon tile pieces. That's kind of been a little side quest of mine since forever, is to find the perfect set of geomorphic dungeon pieces that I can use.
That's what my terrain channel is about.
Isn't it? Sharing some love for Warhammer Quest. Okay, great. But yes, I think on the one hand there is a danger of role-playing games evolving away from role-playing into just board games again.
Yeah.
And that shouldn't be surprising. I mean, humanity went for umpteen million years without role-playing games and feeling more comfortable with games that were a specific set of rules and a finite canned experience with hard limits on it, chess boards that are 8 by 8 squares, period, and that's where the game is going to happen, right? I think that probably there could be something there that is more natural to the human mind, and it may take a bit of an effort to keep people on in the zone of, oh no, we can make things up, which is what role-playing games are all about.
Well, I
So
mean,
that's one side. Yeah, go ahead.
it could actually evolve into something completely different, where obviously role-playing came from wargaming. What will come from role-playing? We won't know until it's created. But there is a possibility of it morphing into something completely different that we would label as something completely different.
Yes.
Yeah.
And by definition, things that nobody's thought of yet are unimaginable.
That's right.
So far. I agree. I was trying to lay out some bookends. Here's one extreme and here's another extreme. And I like to be in the middle. Where do I think is a positive direction that's going in the middle? So I've laid out my extreme where it could just evolve back into board games and the hobby's over. And there are some other people. The guy that reviewed this book, I think the Genius of Dave Arneson, it's called.
I think that's right, yeah.
Which I haven't read yet, so I can't comment on the book itself, just the review that I read. So that's one extreme possibility. Another extreme possibility is the story game people might get their way, and role-playings evolve in completely out of mechanics and completely into social activities of creating stories together, which have existed before in the past. I don't consider them role-playing because they're not immersive, because your role as a player in those games is to be a writer, not to be the character. So that is another way they could go, and that's probably more natural. That's another natural way for
it become more like
evolve into. Yeah.
Probably evolve more towards a theater type scenario.
Yeah. So in the middle, I don't know. I think I'm amused you brought up, the notion that we've got enough role playing games now. I don't see that happening.
I don't think
there are different kinds.
As a creator of a role playing game which hasn't come out, and I'm sure you've made quite a few, if to say no more role playing games, we're like, well, what do you mean? I've got so much stuff I still have to do. There's just so much more that needs to come out.
I have published a good sized handful of different role playing game systems, and every time I publish one, it's like, boy, I wish I had more time to polish this more, and and make sure that everything is just exactly as it should be. And then it comes out, and I play it for a while, and I'm really, really happy because it's doing the things that I designed it to do. And then inevitably I start hitting the rough edges of stuff. And, oh boy, I shouldn't have quite done it that way. Or, ooh, wow, there's a whole other class of mechanics I could use to handle these kinds of things that would do it this other way. So I think there is a lot more work to be done just on the standard tabletop RPG game master and players paradigm. A game master with a set of rules that's their toolbox for resolving things. I think that can go on for a long time, and honestly, there are universal game systems out there, but Champions made a really good, solid try at being a universal system. My third edition Villains Vigilantes is also more of a universal system than just a superhero game, because that is the untold secret about superhero role-playing game systems, is that if they are sufficiently complete, then you really have a universal system, because comic book superheroes includes everything. It includes your magic and your monsters and your spaceships and your alien planets and other dimensions and everything. But then all your work is, even if we someday got the perfect universal game system, which I don't believe we will get, because perfection is a matter of taste when it comes to RPGs, we may get a small handful of like the dominant universal game systems. And we should take a moment after I'm done ranting about this to talk about how there are people who object to the very notion of universal systems. But let me go down this track for a little while. Even if we evolved in the direction of a handful of universal game systems, you'd still have all your work cut out for you when the next movie comes out that is another variant on a genre and introduces new kinds of weird powers and new kinds of monsters and new kinds of environments. You're still going to then have to build those things within the context of your dominant universal systems, right? So I think there's tons of stuff to keep everybody going for as far into the future as I can imagine.
And currently most things are fantasy heavy, so there's a lot of stuff that hasn't been explored in all the other facets of humanity.
And that is like what the big mystery in the hobby since the early days is: how come fantasy it tends to be so much more engaging and appealing for people and attract a bigger audience than, say, science fiction or superheroes. And especially nowadays, superheroes. I do not understand why the biggest RPG, this is me whining a little bit, right? Because I just published a superhero game, but I do not understand why the biggest tabletop RPGs right now are not superhero games, considering what's happening in popular culture. I don't know why. People still, at the end of the day, they'll watch Captain America and Aquaman and Wonder Woman and the Flash on TV and all this stuff, right? And then come home and want to be fighters and magic users and clerics and elves and orcs and goblins. I don't know.
Well,
I don't know.
Also things like, very popular genres like police procedurals and hospital dramas. I mean, obviously, fertile ground in terms of what people like, but whether it, will be a great, I think police procedural, I'd love to play one of those,
I do have a theory why RPGs are so combat centric, as opposed to, imagine a scene where it's a bunch of characters sitting around the table, but they're like they're the hospital, like, operating room staff. And it's like, hand me this scalpel, says the surgeon, your 8th level surgeon. And then the character who's the nurse that hands them the scalpel has to make a check to see if they hand him the right scalpel or something. Somehow that activity has to be turned into an engaging enough, interactive, tense, exciting thing as a big fight.
Yeah.
Right. Fights are just the easiest activity involving a bunch of characters that you can translate into some mechanics and play around a tabletop, and everybody feels like they're doing something and they're paying a lot of attention to, who did what, and well, that guy's hurt, but he's got the thing that we're trying to get, so we need to head him off. Somebody throw a spell on that door, right? That we need activities that are not fights, I think, to be built mechanically to the same degree and with this and producing the same level of excitement for other things besides fights. And I've never seen it done.
There is a Jane Austen role-playing game. I cannot remember the name of it, and I have not played it. But I know that there is one, and I'm a huge fan of Jane Austen. And it's always sort of, for me, you'd obviously then have to go into like a social combat kind of mechanic, because there is no combat.
Right. So then that is a very fruitful area for exploration in game mechanics. But saying there's one game is pretty much the same thing as saying a lot more work needs to be done in this area.
It's only 150 pages. I think you're about 1 billion
Wow.
pages too short.
So,
just cycling back, when you were talking about modules, I have an interest in that because on my channel, Quest Givers with Scotty McFarlane, we do modules. But our philosophy in that is we don't want to give you the monster stats. We don't want to give you all the NPC stats. We basically want to give you a series of events or episodes that happen, and then you fill in what you want as the GM, which way it's going to go. Kind of like almost like the old choose your own adventure kind of books.
Oh, that's cool. I approve of that.
Yeah, and so but for us, we wanted to, because everybody's making modules for D&D because obviously it's the biggest game. But the problem is if you are a small game producer, you have a lack of access, or you just don't have enough time to put out enough modules. So our philosophy is, why not create modules as system neutral, so that you can really just apply whatever mechanics you need for your system over that module. And that's really what we're trying to do, as a publishing entity, I suppose you'd call us, is put out content that can be used in any system.
Can I see some examples of that after we're done here?
Yeah, I'll send them through to you. Yeah, sure.
Great. I've been in our conversations. I've been kind of I name dropped or I mentioned my latest superhero game, but didn't. Yeah. I don't think I named it. I've been staying away from using all of my own work as examples for talking about these things, partly because I don't want to assume that everybody's familiar with the things I've published, and also because I don't want to come across as a self-centered jerk. But I do want to start now referencing some of these things as they relate to the subject we're discussing. So, one of the recent things that I've done is a new game set on the planet Tecumel, which first appeared in TSR's 1975 role-playing game Empire of the Petal Throne. It's the game that when I was a little kid and my eldest brother went off to college and took all of our role-playing stuff with him, he left behind Empire of the Petal Throne. So I cut my teeth on that as a GM. And it's science fantasy, not straight science fiction. And it's not medieval. It's much more like what I call savage fantasy, or pagan, savage fantasy. It's much more like Imperial Rome / Aztec Empire / Babylon, right? Huge cities of monolithics. Well, I'll explain the science fiction element in a moment. On its surface, it's fantasy.
Yeah.
Okay. But it's more armies of naked slaves toiling under the hot sun, building pyramids, and savage gods, some of which accept human sacrifice and stuff like that. It's very dark. It's very adult. The premise is that roundabout now, an atomic war wipes out Western civilization, and so it's the people in the Far East and Africa and places like that who survive and rebuild civilization, eventually go into space, meet other spacefaring civilizations, and go around conquering, terraforming, and colonizing alien worlds, one of which is the planet Tecumel. And then, about 200,000 years in the future, a still unexplained disaster causes Tecumel's entire solar system to drop into a pocket dimension of its own, where, cut off from the interstellar civilization, 200,000 years after that is when the game takes place. And you are the descendants of the colonists who have not even really, you have no clear memories at all of your ultimate origins, but only a mythology. But in that pocket dimension, magic works. So that's the premise of the game. So the reason I brought this up is because we were talking about game systems, and the mechanics I used for that that I used for Bethorm is my Pocket Universe system. Pocket Universe is a 2d10 based skill-based system. So everything is you rolling 2d10s to try to hit a target number or less. Doubles are criticals, and so that doubles that succeed are a critical success, and doubles that fail are a fumble. And you're either rolling against your core attributes or you're rolling against skills that you purchase with experience points. Okay, and that whole system came from my my wife, who's also a gamer, approaching me one day and saying, "Hey, Jeff, do you think a workable set of game mechanics could be built using a 2d10 roll?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. Let's work on that." And it's evolved into something that we find really, really useful for human scale kind of, nitty gritty, realistic stuff. But I don't think it would work for superheroes because it works in a narrow range of power levels. Well, so how did we get talking about where it came? Maybe this was off of our conversation about that there's more sets of game mechanics that you could come up with. Maybe that was what it was.
Well, part of the way I developed 7D system was every role player has a bag full of dice. And, most systems go, okay, you need a D20, you need a D6, or you need and I'm thinking, well, I want to use all my dice, and especially like the D8s and the D12s that never get used for anything other than a damage roll every now and then. But I want to get my bag of dice to get some play. And the mechanic kind of built out, because to me, I like the tactile sense of the character in your hand. Whereas if my character is more powerful, let's take D&D as an example. If you're casting a more powerful fireball, you roll more dice. And you can feel that if you're rolling 10d6, you can feel that the power is, you have that tactile sense in your hand. And I wanted to take that into the actual feel of all the aspects of your character. So if you're stronger, you're rolling like 5 dice, and so it's a pool system, but the difficulty decides which dice you're using. So, if it's let's say a difficulty of 3, you've got to roll d6s to try and get there. Now, the only number you need to see on the dice is a 1, because every single dice has a 1 on it. So if you roll any 1 in your pool, you succeed. So that immediately for me
for harder tasks, you're rolling bigger dice?
Yeah. So like the most difficult. Yeah. So the most difficult task would be a D20, and if you have no skill in it, you roll a single D20, and you need to roll a 1 in order to succeed. So
how do you bridge the gap, probability gap between a D12 and a D20? Because 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 are these nice clean steps of equal increments, right? And then you jump from a 12 to a 20. How do you deal with that?
The difference is, I think, I'd have to look it up, but I think the difference is about 3%. So 12 is 8.6 and 20 is 5. So there's only a 3% difference between the two. So although there is a big jump in terms of the probability, there isn't.
True. You looked at the math and judged it to be workable. Okay, good.
And also they don't make a D14, a D16,
but they do.
But
contrary, you find places that will make those.
But you won't find it in every dice bag. So that was, to me, it was the first thing was, how do I use all my dice? So, and then I go, well, what number is on every dice? Well, the 1 and the 2 are on every single dice if you've got D2s. So the smallest resolution, the most probable one is the D2, which you basically you roll a D6, a 1 to 3, and a 4 to 6. And then you go D4, D6, D8, etc. And so that was sort of my, okay, and now how do I apply this to everything? And once you factor in the experience, and so for each of the 5 successes, you earn an experience point, and then you move to the next. You get another dice to your pool, but you cannot earn experience on that small dice anymore. So you can't earn experience on D2s anymore, only on D4s or higher. So you immediately become the power is more an actual real world progression, because you learn a lot more in the beginning than you do incrementally as you get more and more experienced. So the experience slows down towards the end, obviously then drawing out your character progression. So it's a very simple kind of system, but it allows you to do quite a lot of different things with it. And I just love the tactile sense of, my guy has 5 dice in doing this,
Right.
Whereas the other person has 2, and so there's a visual and tactile sort of interaction there that to me, that's who I am.
Oh, that's cool. Good luck with that. There's something you said made me want to go back. Oh yeah, I remember what it is. Speaking of like the future of the hobby, I'll tell you a thing that, and this is a lead into talking about another one of my games. A thing I've seen the few big RPG manufacturers going toward is artificially creating need for more components, for more stuff, right? Like when you've published a role-playing game that requires or is greatly assisted by also buying a deck of cards for your spells so you can keep track of all that crap, or when they've engineered it so you really want to use their particular miniatures, or they've built a system that requires the absolutely special dice with the special sides that they make. That is a way of sucking more money out of their customers that I do not approve of. Because
I'm very much in the same boat. I'm a firm believer of that. It's like if I'm reading your rules and I can use what I have, fabulous. If you sell something that works with your system, like the cards, for instance, they may have spell cards, but you don't need the spell cards to play. Right. That I'm okay with, but I'm not okay with you have to have the spell cards to play.
Right.
That's problematic for me. And yeah, I think you and I are on the same page with that one.
So that is what led to that and another weird thing. My dad did not understand RPGs. He did not understand fantasy or science fiction or superheroes. Had no use for any of that stuff, right? I just established this as a fact, and let's set that aside for a moment. So one day I'm running my Mighty Protectors campaign, and I like to do some off the wall stuff every once in a while. I've been doing a series of adventures where my players' heroes were in this parallel dimension that was like the last dimension the demons had to fight their way through before they could get to ours. And they had fight after fight after fight. And finally, I said, I got to resolve this. So the big demon appears to them and says, I am tired of this back and forth. Also, we're going to do one final contest to see who wins, right? And if we win, you have to let us through to your dimension to have our war. And if you win, we'll go back home. And to make it fair to you, we're going to pick a competition from your world that we're going to compete at, and the winner is the winner. And they picked American baseball. So I came up with some quick rules for baseball for Mighty Protectors, a few extra things for where you're throwing the ball to the next guy, and where when you hit the ball, where does it go, and do you hit, and stuff like that. And we played one inning of baseball with the superheroes versus the demons. And at the end, and the players loved the session. And at the end of it, I'm thinking, my dad had no comprehension of anything that I was doing. but he would have totally understood that.
Yep.
Maybe not the fact that this guy running around the bases is invulnerable to acid damage or whatever. Right now, he wouldn't have understood the weird powers, but he totally would have understood the baseball. So, in a world where, and this is maybe getting to be less of an issue over time, but back in those days, there was a lot of concern that the hobby might be dying, that there were not enough young people coming in, that it was too niche, and people didn't understand it. And then I look at the big companies, and they're making these games where they're going to bigger and bigger, glossier, full color, expensive rule books where it costs you upwards of $100 to just get the core books of the game. And then they want you to have the special dice and the special minis and all this paraphernalia. And I thought, this is not tenable. We need RPGs that are going to be completely understandable to brand new people and be as cheap as possible while giving them the full experience, and not requiring a huge investment in stuff. And so I thought, well, what is the smallest amount of material that you could possibly need to play an RPG? Well, that's a thing you could play if you had the book and nothing else.
Yeah.
I said, well, but you can't really, you have to have something. So it has to be something that's free. So, well, it suddenly struck me, cavemen did not have dice or copying machines. They didn't even have books, right? But they didn't have any of the stuff that we have gotten so used to using to make our role-playing games go. But they had rocks. What kind of mechanics could I write that would work with like a handful of pebbles scooped up from the ground? Me and I like to talk about picking up pebbles. So
you're a big fan.
So I came up with a mechanic that evolved into my game Cave Master, which is not just a caveman role-playing game, but literally the idea is, if cavemen had thought of role-playing games, how could they do it? So I'll quickly tell you 90% of the rules, so you don't have to even buy the rule book. You have you get a character skin. This is a thing you can print out on your printer, but it's an animal skin outline with nothing in it. And most appropriately, you draw a charred stick from out of the fire pit, and your character skin is an actual animal skin, and you scrawl some circles with pictograms in them, and then you put pebbles in those circles, and the more pebbles you have in each circle represent how much better you are at the ability represented by the pictogram in that circle. And when there is a challenge, you pick up the stones representing the ability that you've got that is relevant. And the cave master, who's like, the old man of the tribe who runs your role-playing games for you, picks up pebbles that represent the difficulty of the task. You secretly split them between your two hands, right? So there's some in each hand. And then the cave master does that. You each pick one of the other person's hands, reveal, and compare. And whoever has the most stones succeeded. And I built a whole system around this, and it actually works shockingly well.
It's beautifully simplistic. It's like, in its simplicity, it's beautiful. It's like, that's...
Thank you. And everything about it is designed to free you from having to have any components, including the rule book, right? Once you've learned it, there is a simple process for statting out creatures. There's a simple process for statting out new kinds of weapons. There's an optional spirit magic system, because you don't have to play this as fantasy cavemen if you don't want to. That's an option. And there's a simple idea that tells you how to stat out your different spirit magic effects. So literally, if my friends and I ever crash on a desert island, we can role play with, we can get some palm leaves and some pebbles, or draw with a stick in the sand if we have to, right? Boom, we're all set to go.
The problem is you get distracted by the cruise. You get the cruise ships going past, and you're too distracted by the game that you don't get rescued.
Yeah, well, if those people on the cruise ship knew what we were doing, they would want to stop, get off, and stay with us.
Yes, it's a new fun island we've discovered.
So that was that. That's Cave Master. So I think there is that was my answer to this other possibility for the way that role-playing games could evolve in the future into requiring so much paraphernalia that they just, die under the weight of their own material components. But I've designed the game that will save us from that, so we can all rest easy now.
It kind of goes into, there's innovation and there's gimmick. And I find a lot of the games where you got to buy all the stuff, you're investing in the gimmick, and the long-term innovation, it doesn't. If it's not innovative, it doesn't stick. Over time, it'll just fall away.
and we've just come back to this is our opening to talk about how some people hate universal systems because they think that you really need to tune a set of mechanics to a particular setting and a particular mood. And I'm not against that, but I also think that there is a lot of value in an underlying core mechanic that is very powerful. Even if I was designing, a horror game, which I've got some thoughts about, but I haven't done it yet. I would want the basic mechanics of that game to be solid enough that I could rip them out of the horror game and use them as the core of some other game too. I wouldn't want to design a thing that's like horror is absolutely all it does. I mean, what if your characters in your horror game, it's a cutscene and you're at a restaurant and something happens. You don't. You're not
always on the ground.
It should always be about horror. That you should totally have solid mechanics for that.
Absolutely.
But Cave Master, after I had designed this system, I actually agonized for a while about whether I should release it as a caveman game. I said, we've got a really powerful little system here that. The only reason we're calling it cavemen, saying it's about cavemen, really is because we use rocks. But you could use anything. You could use dice as your rocks and just ignore the pips on them and never roll them, and it would still work. And my wife said no, because it fits that genre so well that you should do it. So that I didn't start going, I should design a game for cavemen. I started saying I want to design a game that is absolutely as accessible as it possibly could be. And if I then married those two things, if I made a game about playing baseball that used handfuls of objects and that simple little mechanism, right? My dad would have totally gotten it and played it.
Well, I'm sure you've been in the same boat where you have to obviously show people your game and get them to play. And I'm pretty confident from what you've described, Cave Master could be picked up in 5 minutes. A new person who's never role played before would get it in the first. Oh, okay. Done.
It's also turned out to be amazingly good for little kids.
Yeah.
We designed it kind of for cavemen, but it turns out things cavemen can understand are also things little kids can understand. This is Fifth Arm, the Plane of Tekaba. This is the hardcover edition. Painting by Dennis Loubet, who did a lot of cover paintings for Steve Jackson games back in the day, and is a good friend of mine, and we game together all the time and stuff. That is the Tekkamel role-playing game. Awesome, very dark, very adult, savage fantasy. And then this is Cave Master. That's a painting by my wife and partner, who goes by Talshamir. And it's a thin book because that's all it has to be. There's support products for all these too. Cave Master has Dinosaurs of the Lost Valley, which like the core rule book only has a few dinosaurs in it, like in bad caveman movies, where they don't really belong. But if you really want your dinosaurs, we got a whole book on dinosaurs and adds some playable dinosaur-based races that are fun. And then my baby, the thing I've just most recently come up with is Mighty Protectors. This is the third edition of the Villains Vigilantes superhero role-playing game that originally came out in 1979 when I was in high school. And it's not that heavy duty. It's quite a bit bigger than earlier editions, but not. I believe in writing only the amount of rules that you actually really need. And I just want to say the big difference in Mighty Protectors from earlier editions of V&V is we have made it a fully integrated random and point construction character generation system. So if you have no concept, you can roll dice, and the dice will spend your points on abilities for you. You make some creative choices along the way, but then at the end of that process, you have a workable character. Or if you have a character in mind, you can just sit down and spend points on the available abilities and build that guy. So that's the big difference. And I'm done.
Well, I urge everybody to check those out, especially the Cave Master. I'm getting a copy of that. Do you have any collectible rocks for sale?
With the Kickstarter project that funded that, we made available these little stone pouches.
Oh, cool.
I don't know how well I came up with a design. I'm not that much of a craft type person, arts and crafts person, but it is. Let's find the camera. Here it is with my little rocks inside. But no, we don't make those anymore. So you have to make your own. Kill your own buffalo and
I've got to go and find my own rocks.
You'll have to find. Believe me, when we were first creating that game, we conceived of using rocks as miniatures. Yeah. And believe me, I don't know if you have a dog, but for me, walking the dog was a completely different experience when I was constantly scanning the ground for something that would make a good cave bear. So
I can immediately think of things like shells and twigs, and you could go.
This happens to be in reach. We found a kit at a craft store that sold these little soapstone ingots, like 1 inch long and a 1/2 inch around. And they came with a little file so you could carve them. And my partner Talshimir carved these little miniatures, little stone miniatures. But at conventions and stuff, we don't use those. They're too hard to tell apart. That's the problem. Actual minis work better, but sorry. I'll keep coming up with things if you don't end your show. So let's say goodbye.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. It's been great, and hopefully we can do this again in the future, because it was.
I would be happy to.
So much ground that hasn't been covered. Thank you very much for joining me, Jeff. It's been a wonderful experience.
Is there anything that we haven't covered that you feel bad about? Because we could come back.
No, I'm just. Okay. We could have talked about the first thing on the list for hours.
I kind of thought that's what we did.